I stood frozen, a shattered wine glass in my bleeding hand, surrounded by silence that screamed louder than any insult. My daughter-in-law's mother clutched her designer dress, now stained deep red, like I'd bled on it myself. Isabel slapped me across the face and called me useless. Ethan, my only child, laughed. Not nervous laughter, not embarrassed, but the kind of laughter that says, "You mean nothing now." I had raised him alone, sold heirlooms for his future, eaten canned soup while funding his dreams. And in return, I was publicly humiliated, discarded like a dirty napkin. I walked out of that wedding alone. No one followed, but what they didn't know was I kept every receipt, every promise, every betrayal. And this time, I wasn't walking away in shame. I was walking towards something they never expected, my own reckoning. Stay with me. This story doesn't end in tears. It begins with them. My name is Marion Grace. I'm 67 years old, and for the past 4 decades, I lived in a modest house in a quiet Tennessee town where the summers were long and the winters smelled like wood smoke and old memories. I raised my son, Ethan, on my own since he was 6. His father left us with a note on the kitchen table and a promise that turned out to be as empty as the bank account he drained on his way out. I never remarried. Not because I didn't have the chance, but because I couldn't imagine splitting my heart again. I gave all of it to Ethan. For years, I worked double shifts at the local hospital, first on the pediatric floor, then in geriatrics as my back got weaker and my patients stronger. I came home late, feet swollen, hands raw from the sanitizing agents, but always with a smile when Ethan greeted me at the door. He never knew I skipped meals to afford his piano lessons, or that I sewed his clothes at night by the dim kitchen light when he slept. He never saw the final notice I paid off by selling my engagement ring, or how I cried quietly in the bathroom when he needed braces we couldn't afford. Somehow, we made it work. Ethan was bright, funny, ambitious. I still remember his first school play. He was a tree, and he stood there swaying back and forth like the world depended on his leaves. I clapped so hard my hands hurt. From those tiny stages to his high school graduation, I was always the loudest cheerleader in the room, even when I had to sit at the back because my uniform smelled faintly of disinfectant. When he got accepted into college, I cried so hard that the woman at the gas station asked if I'd lost someone. I almost said yes. I'd lost the little boy who used to draw me hearts in crayon, traded for a young man in a suit who called less and less as the years passed. But now, Ethan was getting married to Isabel. The wedding was to be held at a vineyard 2 towns over, one of those places where the napkins had embroidered initials, and the bathroom smelled like lavender and luxury. I wanted to look my best, not for me, but so Ethan wouldn't feel ashamed. I took my old navy dress out of the cedar chest, the one I wore to his college graduation, and let out the seams carefully with a needle that trembled slightly in my hand. I polished my low heels, practiced standing straighter in front of the mirror, even dabbed a bit of blush on my cheeks, something I hadn't done in years. I didn't want to look too old, too tired, too out of place. I knew the guest list would be filled with people far removed from my world, investors, executives, people who summered in places I'd only read about in travel magazines at the hair salon. But I told myself it didn't matter. Ethan would be proud to have me there. I imagined him smiling when he saw me, guiding me to my seat with a proud, "This is my mom." I clung to that hope like a lifeline. A week before the wedding, I received the invitation in the mail. Thick cardstock, gold lettering, everything elegant and proper. I ran my fingers over the raised ink and smiled. I thought it was odd that the RSVP card didn't include Mother of the Groom, just my name typed under guest. But I brushed it off. Maybe it was just a formatting thing, or a mistake from the printing company, nothing to read into. In the days leading up to the wedding, I busied myself with small preparations. I practiced walking slowly and gracefully in my heels. No limping, no shuffle. I reread old letters Ethan wrote from college, the ones where he told me he missed my cooking, where he thanked me for everything, where he signed off with, "Love you, Mom," always. I tucked one of those letters into my purse. A reminder of the boy I raised, the boy I thought would never forget me. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, remembering Ethan at 5, curled against me after a nightmare, his small hand wrapped around my thumb like it was the only thing anchoring him to this world. I had anchored him for so long, and now I just hoped, desperately, that in this new chapter of his life, I still had a place somewhere in the margins. The morning of the wedding, I placed the invitation carefully into my purse, next to the letter Ethan wrote me years ago. It felt like carrying little pieces of our history, of our bond. As I smoothed the navy dress over my hips, I caught my reflection in the mirror, shoulders back, chin high, cheeks slightly flushed. I looked not young, but strong, proud, ready. But then as I glanced again at the invitation to double-check the address, something snagged in my mind. I reread the front. "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Ethan James Parker and Isabel Lorraine Sinclair." My name was printed neatly below in small font under guest, not mother of the groom, just guest. I stared at the words for a moment longer, the letters seeming to blur slightly. Surely that was just a stylistic choice. Maybe they hadn't listed titles for anyone. I turned the invitation over and scanned it again. Parents of the bride, Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair. Wedding planner, Helena Hart. My name was nowhere else. I hesitated for a moment, that little tug of unease curling somewhere low in my stomach. But I shook it off. It was a big wedding, full of details and logistics. These things happened. Ethan wouldn't let me feel small, not today. I slipped the invitation back into my purse, forced a smile at my reflection, and whispered, "Stop being dramatic." The venue was beautiful. Rolling hills of grapevines, lanterns strung along the path, violin music floating on the breeze. I followed the usher down a long aisle of chairs, expecting to be taken near the front. Instead, we passed row after row of perfectly styled guests until we reached a small table tucked to the far right side near the speakers. "This is you," the usher said, gesturing politely. The table already had a few people seated, strangers in cocktail dresses and polished shoes, none of whom looked familiar. One man nodded politely, the rest barely glanced up. I smiled nervously and sat down, folding my hands in my lap. Maybe the front seats were reserved for family. Maybe Ethan was going to move me later. As I sat quietly, I saw Lorraine being escorted to the front, her hair in an elegant updo, her gown shimmering gold in the sunlight. The photographer hovered near her like bees to sugar. Ethan walked beside her, guiding her gently, protectively. I held my breath. I waited for him to look toward me, to wave, to signal something. But he didn't even glance in my direction. When Isabel and her bridesmaids arrived, everyone stood. I stood too, though it felt like I wasn't part of the same moment. My vantage point gave me a perfect view of everything, but I felt invisible, like I was watching through glass. When Isabel reached the altar, she kissed her father's cheek and embraced Lorraine tightly, whispering something in her ear that made both of them laugh. After the ceremony, as guests filtered toward the reception hall, I spotted Isabel speaking with a group of guests. I approached slowly, hoping to greet her, to say something kind, but as I neared, she took a half step back, barely masking her discomfort. She reached out to squeeze my hand briefly, then quickly withdrew. "Hi, Marion," she said coolly. "I think Ethan's still with the photographer. My mom's a bit exhausted, so we're all just trying to keep things smooth. Hope you found your seat okay." She didn't hug me. She didn't even ask how I was. Just that Ethan was busy, her mother was tired, and I had found my seat. Before I could respond, she turned to another guest with a bright smile, already moving on. I stood there for a beat too long, unsure of where to go. People swirled around me, laughing, clinking glasses. I was a dot on the edges of a painting I thought I was part of. Still, I smiled. I told myself Ethan would come find me soon. He was just busy. overwhelmed. Weddings were stressful, right? He'd see me later, wrap me in a hug, thank me for everything. That's what sons did. That's what my son would do. So I sat quietly at my distant table, sipping lukewarm water, watching from afar. The music swelled. The toasts began. And still, I waited. The clinking of glasses, the gentle hum of conversation, and the soft melody of a string quartet filled the reception hall with a dreamlike air. Marion sat at her isolated table, her hands folded in her lap, the corners of her mouth pulled into a tight smile she had practiced in the mirror just that morning. From where she sat, she could see Ethan standing next to Isabel, laughing with a group of sharply dressed men who looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine ad. He hadn't noticed her yet, or perhaps, she thought bitterly, he had and chose to keep his distance. She wanted to get up, to go say something, but the weight of the day clung to her shoulders like a soaked wool coat. So she stayed put, waiting for her moment, her glass of red wine trembling slightly in her hand. Just one toast, she thought. One chance to stand, raise a glass, and speak from the heart. Then, without warning, someone bumped into her from behind. The motion was small, barely more than a nudge, but enough to send the wine sloshing over the rim of the glass. Time slowed. Marion watched in horror as the crimson liquid arced through the air, heading straight for the golden shimmer of Lorraine Sinclair's couture gown. The splash was devastating. The deep red wine bloomed across the delicate fabric like a wound, soaking into the silk and spreading fast. Lorraine gasped, looking down at the stain as if she'd been physically struck. For a beat, the room stood still. Conversations paused. Forks stopped mid-air. "Oh my God," Marion whispered, leaping to her feet, napkin in hand. "I'm so sorry. Let me help." "You've ruined it," Lorraine shrieked, backing away in horror. "This was custom made. Do you even understand what $50,000 looks like? Clearly not." Please, it was an accident," Marion stammered, reaching forward with shaking hands. And then, out of nowhere, Isabel appeared. The slap came with such force that Marion staggered backward. The room echoed with the sharp crack of skin against skin. Marion's cheek flared with heat, her mouth falling open in shock. "Useless old woman," Isabel hissed, her eyes flashing. "You've embarrassed this entire family. Clean it up, now." Marion stared, frozen, her ears ringing. The napkin dropped from her fingers. Her heart thundered in her chest, the embarrassment flooding her like a tidal wave she couldn't stop. She turned, desperate for one face, just one, that would offer her comfort or even a kind word. Instead, she saw Ethan, standing just a few feet away, watching it all. He wasn't angry. He wasn't horrified. He was laughing. Not a nervous chuckle, not a strained smile. A full, hearty laugh that made his shoulders bounce, as if his mother being slapped and scolded was the most entertaining part of the evening. "Mom's always been clumsy," he said, waving a hand toward her, not even bothering to look her in the eyes. "Remember when she dropped my birthday cake? Some things never change." The words hit harder than the slap. They knocked the breath from her lungs, stole the ground beneath her feet. People turned away, murmurs passing like wildfire. Guests whispered behind raised hands. Marion could feel their eyes, cold, judging, superior, crawling across her skin. She bent down, hands trembling, trying to gather the broken pieces of the wine glass that had shattered when it hit the floor. No one helped. Not a single person moved. They just watched as the 67-year-old woman knelt like a child, scooping shards into her bare hands while blood began to bead at her fingertips. Lorraine stood nearby, arms crossed, her face twisted in disgust. "You'll get the cleaning bill," she sneered, "though frankly, I doubt that dress is salvageable." Marion nodded, eyes downcast. "Of course," she whispered. Inside, something cracked. Not like glass. Glass breaks with a sound, a finality. This was quieter, a tearing. a slow, agonizing unspooling of something that had held her together for decades. She stood finally, her hands bleeding, her knees aching, her pride shattered. She turned toward the exit, the room still buzzing with judgment. Ethan was already walking away, arm around Isabel, comforting her like she had been the one assaulted. No one stopped Marion. No one called her name. She left the wedding in silence, her shoes clicking against marble floors, her face burning with humiliation that would never wash away. Marion walked out of the reception hall with her back straight, though everything inside her had caved in. Her cheek still stung from Isabel's slap, and the wine glass had sliced a thin line across her palm, leaving a trail of blood that stained the napkin she held uselessly. No one followed. No one called out. She walked past servers carrying trays, past guests who turned to look but quickly turned back, pretending not to see. Outside, the air was cool and quiet compared to the noise inside. She made her way to the parking lot, the gravel crunching under her shoes. Her car sat in the farthest row. She hadn't wanted to take a premium spot. She never did. As she approached, she heard a phone camera click. She turned her head instinctively and caught sight of a young man in a tailored suit, quickly lowering his phone. He didn't offer help, didn't even apologize. He just walked back toward the reception, likely eager to share the scandalous footage of the groom's mother getting slapped at the wedding. That was the first twist. The proof of her humiliation would live online before she even made it home. By the time she got into her car, Marion's hands were shaking. Blood had soaked into the edge of her shawl, and her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. She sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring out into the growing twilight. Her heart pounded not from pain, but from something deeper, something older, something like betrayal. The drive home was silent. No music, no thoughts. Just the steady hum of tires on asphalt and the echo of Ethan's laughter replaying again and again in her ears. When she stepped into her house, she didn't take off her shoes. She walked straight to the hallway closet, pulled down the old cedar box from the top shelf, the one that held decades of memories. She carried it to the living room, set it on the coffee table, and opened the lid. Inside were photo albums, drawings from kindergarten, a baby tooth still taped to an index card. She pulled out a picture of Ethan at 3 years old, dressed as a lion for Halloween. Another of him at 10, holding a fishing rod taller than he was. Each photo felt like a stab, a reminder of everything she had poured into a son who now saw her as disposable. She laid the pictures out across the table, a silent timeline of sacrifice and pride. Then she took the wedding invitation from her purse and placed it on top of the photos. The gold lettering glared under the living room lamp. Guest. Not mother, not even Mrs. Grace, just guest. She leaned back on the couch, hands clasped in her lap, and stared at the cruel contrast. Decades of unconditional love, now overshadowed by one word that reduced her to an afterthought. As she gathered the photos to put them away, something slipped from between two envelopes, a second wedding invitation. Her breath caught as she picked it up. It was addressed to Mrs. Beatrice Holloway. The return address was the same. The style was identical, but this one said, "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Ethan James Parker and Isabel Lorraine Sinclair, mother of the bride, Beatrice Holloway." Marion blinked, her hands trembling. Mother of the bride? Beatrice wasn't Isabel's biological mother. She was her stepmother, married to Isabel's father for less than 10 years. Marion remembered Isabel once mentioning her real mother had passed away when she was young, and yet Beatrice was honored, acknowledged, printed in gold foil, no less. She flipped the envelope over, confirming the address. It wasn't sent here by mistake. Beatrice had been intentionally listed and sent an official card. Marion had been deliberately excluded. A wave of cold swept through her. Not anger, at least not yet. It was something worse, a clarity so sharp it cut deeper than rage. She wasn't overlooked. She wasn't forgotten. She had been erased, deliberately. This wedding wasn't the beginning of a new family, a merging of love and tradition. It was a division, a closing of the door. Marian clutched the two invitations, hers and Beatrice's, one cold, empty, impersonal, the other glowing with recognition. She laid them side by side and stared for a long time, as if they might change, as if the truth they revealed wasn't final. But it was. She was never meant to belong. 3 weeks passed in silence. Not a single call, not a text. Not even a forwarded email from Ethan about leftover wedding decor or family photos. Marian's phone sat untouched on the kitchen counter, its screen dark and mute. She stopped checking it after the 10th day. It wasn't dead. It just had no reason to live. The days blended together like colors left too long in the wash. Blurry, dull, fading. Marian moved through the house as though she were haunting it, not living in it. She forgot to turn on lights. She let dishes pile in the sink. The groceries she bought before the wedding spoiled in the fridge, untouched, like the hopes she'd carried with her that day. She hadn't left the house since the wedding. There was no one to visit, nowhere she needed to be. Her life, once full of shifts, alarms, prescriptions, and reminders, was now reduced to the slow ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the groan of floorboards when she moved from one room to another. On the 22nd day, something shifted. Not hope, not energy, but restlessness. A deep, scratching anxiety in her chest that wouldn't go away. She needed to do something, anything, to quiet the noise in her head. So she chose a task that seemed safe, mechanical. Cleaning the spare bedroom. The room had become a catch-all over the years. Boxes of old clothes, stacks of books, unopened mail, and forgotten Christmas decorations crowded the shelves. Marian moved slowly, pulling items out, sorting them into piles. Some things went into a box for donation, others into the trash. Some, too sentimental to toss, too painful to keep, were stacked into a decide later pile. It was during this clearing, when she knelt down to reach a box shoved deep into the closet corner, that she found it. The box was labeled taxes and receipts in her handwriting, but it was heavier than she remembered. She pulled it out, set it on the bed, and opened the lid. Inside were folders, neatly labeled and stacked, and a small accordion file. At first, she assumed it was just old tax returns, but as she opened the folders one by one, she realized what it truly was: her life's ledger. Each folder held documents tied to Ethan. A receipt from the orthodontist, dated when he was 13. A loan form from his university. Pay stubs from her weekend job cleaning doctors' offices. The money she used to cover his housing during college. There was a folder labeled College Fund Emergency Loans. Inside was a handwritten promissory note. Ethan had needed $2,500 for a summer program. Marian had taken the money from her retirement savings. He'd signed the paper himself. "I promised to pay you back within 6 months." He never did. Another folder, dated 5 years later, was thicker. Inside were mortgage documents. Marian's signature appeared on one of the lines as a co-signer. She remembered the day Ethan came over, said he and Isabel had found their dream home but were a little short. Just a formality, he'd said. They wouldn't need her money, just her name. But the final folder was the one that stopped her cold. It was labeled Wedding. Inside were receipts, bank statements, and a printed email chain from Ethan asking for help with venue costs, honeymoon deposits, and even Isabel's dress alterations. The total was staggering. Over $45,000, all given in pieces, over time. So Marian hadn't seen the full picture until now. She sat back, stunned, her breath shallow. The math was simple now. Thousands upon thousands of dollars spent over decades, loaned, gifted, scraped together from her savings, her pension, her overtime shifts, all of it for Ethan. And in return, a slap, a laugh, a cold seat at a wedding she helped fund. She reached into the box again and found a crumpled envelope at the bottom. It held a copy of a check she'd written to Ethan 2 years ago. In the memo line, her own handwriting read, "For your future." A lump rose in her throat. How many times had she said that? For your future. Not once had she asked for anything back. Not money, not gratitude, just the belief, deep, desperate, that Ethan would remember who got him there, that her sacrifices meant something. She looked around the room. Dust floated in the light from the window. The shelves were half empty now. Her knees ached from kneeling, but her hands shook not from exertion. This time, it was the weight of reality finally sinking in. Her son hadn't forgotten her. He had erased her. And now, the only record that she ever mattered sat in a battered box of receipts and unpaid promises. The afternoon sun slanted through the bedroom window, casting long golden rays across the documents Marion had spread out on the floor, like puzzle pieces. She hadn't moved in nearly an hour, just sat, cross-legged, sifting through the mountain of receipts and letters that laid bare the history of her sacrifice. Near the bottom of the box, tucked inside a faded manila envelope, was a single sheet of paper that made her heart stutter. The ink was smudged slightly, but the words were clear. I, Ethan J. Parker, agree to repay my mother, Marion Grace, the amount of $20,000 within 6 months of this date. This money is to be used for medical expenses related to Isabel's condition. Interest optional, but full repayment expected. Beneath it, in Ethan's bold, confident script, was his signature, dated April 15, 2019. Marion stared at the page for a long time. It was the first and only time Ethan had acknowledged one of their financial transactions in writing. She remembered the conversation. He had come to her with pleading eyes, saying Isabel needed a specialist not covered by insurance. There had been urgency in his voice, desperation in his tone. She hadn't hesitated. She never did. She'd liquidated one of her small CDs, the kind of quiet savings account she rarely touched, and handed him the money the same afternoon. That was 6 years ago. Not a cent had been returned. She picked up her reading glasses, adjusted the frames with trembling fingers, and scanned the pile again. There, beneath an old bank statement, was another envelope marked Investments. Her stomach turned as she opened it. Inside were several printed screenshots from Ethan's online brokerage account. The dates matched the same month she'd written him the check. The transactions told a very different story. Apple, Tesla, cryptocurrency, thousands of dollars, all invested within weeks of her giving him the money. There was no emergency room visit, no specialist, no hospital. He had lied. Not just borrowed too much, not just forgotten to repay. He had stood in her kitchen, looked her in the eye, and manufactured a crisis to manipulate her love. She felt the air leave her lungs like she'd been struck. Her fingers went cold. The edges of the documents blurred behind welling tears. 15 years. That was how long she'd been slowly bleeding herself dry for someone who saw her as nothing but an ATM. An invisible ATM. One who never asked questions, who never charged interest, who gave everything and expected only love in return. And what had she received? Lies. A seat in the corner, a slap, a laugh. She gathered all the papers, every receipt, every promise, every trace of deceit, and stood. Her hands moved with quiet fury as she walked to the fireplace in the living room. She threw open the grate, stacked the documents inside like firewood, and grabbed a box of matches from the mantel. Her hand hovered over the box. The flick of her wrist paused mid-motion. Burn it. Let it all go. Let the past turn to ash. It was tempting, clean, final. But then another voice whispered inside her, quiet at first, then stronger, steadier. This isn't closure. This is erasure. Again. She looked down at the documents. These were her proof, her receipts, not just of money, but of love, of care, of years no one else had bothered to remember. Burning them wouldn't free her. It would silence her. She stepped back from the fireplace and knelt down, slowly pulling the papers out. She smoothed the pages with careful fingers, stacked them back into the folders, and returned them to the box. She would not disappear. Not again. For the first time in weeks, a tiny spark ignited inside her chest. Not rage, not pain, but resolve. Clear, cold, righteous. They wanted her to vanish quietly, to absorb the shame, to disappear like a servant dismissed from the room. But not this time. She stood up straighter. Her shoulders, though still tired, no longer sagged with defeat. Marian Grace had been many things in her life: a nurse, a mother, a giver. But now she would be something she had never dared to be before. A woman who demanded to be seen. It started with a Google search. Financial abuse by adult children. Marian hadn't even known what to call it, this quiet erosion of her bank account, her trust, her role as a mother. But the phrase fit too well. It led her to forums, articles, and at last, to a name. Margaret T. Holbrook, attorney at law. The reviews called her ferocious, compassionate, and relentless. One client had written, "She doesn't just fight for your rights, she reminds you why you had them to begin with." Marian dialed the number with hands that trembled more from nerves than age. A calm receptionist answered and booked her in for a consultation the following Thursday. The office was nothing like she expected. Tucked inside a refurbished Victorian house on the edge of downtown, it smelled faintly of peppermint tea and old books. The waiting room was cozy, with a fireplace and soft music playing somewhere in the background, a far cry from the sterile, glass-towered firms she had imagined in her head. Places where people like her would stick out like a sore thumb. Margaret was in her early 70s, with snow-white hair pulled into a sharp twist and piercing eyes that missed nothing. She wore a navy blue blazer and flats. No nonsense in her stance or her handshake. "I read your intake form," she said as Marian sat across from her, "but I want to hear it in your words. Take your time." Marian began slowly, haltingly, but as she spoke about the loans, the deception, the slap at the wedding, something inside her unlocked. The words came faster, steadier, her voice gaining strength like a river, finally breaking past a dam. When she was done, Margaret leaned back, steepling her fingers. "Mrs. Grace, what your son has done, over many years, is financial exploitation. It falls under elder abuse statutes in this state." Marian blinked. "Even if I gave him the money willingly?" "You gave it under false pretenses," Margaret said firmly. "He lied. He coerced. He manipulated your trust. And you have documentation, loan agreements, check memos, email trails. That's gold." Marian swallowed. "I don't want to send him to jail. I'm not looking for revenge." "You're looking for dignity," Margaret said gently. "Accountability. You're not wrong for wanting that." They reviewed the documents together for nearly 2 hours. Margaret took notes, made copies, and finally tapped her pen against her notepad with finality. "Here's what I recommend. We begin with a formal demand letter. No threats, no drama, just a clear statement of the money owed, supported by your documentation, and a request for repayment within 30 days. That keeps things civil. If he refuses, we escalate." "How much?" Marian asked softly. "With all your records and considering inflation and basic interest rates, I'd say we're looking at approximately $87,000, possibly more, but that's a solid start." Marian nodded. "Do it." The words came out before she had time to second guess, but they felt right. Margaret smiled. "Good. You'll hear from me by Monday." That night, Marian didn't cry. She didn't pace the hallway or reread Ethan's old letters. Instead, she made herself a salad, fresh spinach, grilled chicken, a little olive oil, and turned off her phone. Then she dug out the dusty yoga DVD that had sat unopened for years in the TV stand and stretched awkwardly in her living room until her muscles ached and her breath came heavy. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The next morning, she started journaling. The pages filled quickly, not with rage or revenge fantasies, but with thoughts she hadn't let herself voice in years. She wrote about the first time Ethan walked, the time he skinned his knee and she carried him home on her back. She wrote about her own mother, about loneliness, about strength. Each page gave her a little more space, a little more breath. She swapped her grocery list from frozen meals to fresh produce, took slow walks around the block, waving at neighbors she hadn't spoken to in months. She called her doctor and scheduled a long overdue checkup. She even painted her nails a soft rose color, not for anyone else, but because it made her hands look less like instruments of labor and more like hands that still had stories to tell. By the end of the week, Margaret's office called. The demand letter had been sent. Certified, tracked, official. Marian read a copy of it twice. Dear Mr. Parker, this letter serves as formal notice that you owe Marian Grace a documented total of $87,000 for loans and financial support, extended between the years 2008 and 2023. These amounts are substantiated by promissory notes, personal checks, email correspondence, and bank statements, all of which are available for legal review. You have 30 days to respond and arrange repayment. Failure to do so will result in legal action. It was clinical, firm, precise. It was perfect. Marian folded the letter carefully and placed it in her journal. The quiet rebellion had begun, not with flames or screams, but with a steady reclaiming of self, of worth, of voice. And this time, she would not be silenced. The call never came. Marian had watched her phone for the first few days after the demand letter went out, expecting, half out of hope, half from dread, that Ethan would at least reach out. But it remained stubbornly silent. No texts, no missed calls, no knock at the door, until day 11. It was nearly noon when the sleek white BMW pulled into her driveway. Marian was in the kitchen, journaling with a cup of green tea, when she saw the flash of chrome through the window. Her stomach tensed, but she didn't move. She'd been waiting for this. The knock was soft, almost polite. Marian opened the door slowly. Isabel stood there, designer sunglasses perched on her head, a silk blouse tucked into perfectly pressed pants, and a carefully rehearsed smile on her lips. But her eyes were searching. Marian, she said, voice breathy. I was hoping we could talk. Just the two of us. Marian stepped aside, offering no words. She gestured toward the couch. Isabel sat primly, her knees together, hands clasped in her lap. I know things have been tense, Isabel began, but Ethan and I were so surprised by this letter, it caught us completely off guard. Marian said nothing, just tilted her head slightly. I mean, of course, we appreciate everything you've done, Isabel continued, her voice softening. We really do. And if there were miscommunications about money, well, I think we can work through this, without involving lawyers. Families should handle things like families, don't you think? Marian leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Isabel, she said, voice calm, do you know what I did last night? Isabel blinked, confused. I made lemon chicken, with rosemary and thyme. It's Ethan's favorite, or at least it used to be. I made it for 20 years. But last night, I made it just for me. Isabel offered a tight smile. That's nice. Marian's gaze didn't waver. It was delicious, and I didn't save any leftovers. For the first time in years, I didn't think, maybe he'll drop by, because now I know he won't. Before Isabel could respond, the front door opened without knocking. Ethan. He walked in fast, his expression already tense, jaw tight, eyes scanning his mother and wife like a man walking into a courtroom. Mom? He said curtly. You could have just called. This letter? What the hell? Marian stood. You can sit or you can stand, but you will not raise your voice in my house. Ethan hesitated, surprised at her tone. He sat. I can't believe you're doing this, he said. After everything, you want to embarrass me? In court? Over what? Some old checks and misunderstandings? Misunderstandings, Marion repeated, her voice even. Which part did I misunderstand? The lie about Isabel's medical emergency, or the $20,000 that went into stock trades 3 days later? Ethan's face reddened. That wasn't how it... Don't lie, Ethan, she interrupted. Not now. Not when we both know I kept everything. Every check, every email, every receipt. Isabel's eyes darted between them, her confidence unraveling. We can pay you back. Just not all at once. Marion stepped toward the side table and opened a drawer. She pulled out a small black device, sleek and unmistakable, a voice recorder. Also, Marion said, placing it gently on the table, I've started recording conversations, just in case, including this one. Ethan's face drained of color. Isabel's mouth opened, but no words came. I wasn't sure if you'd try to guilt me, Marion continued, or threaten me, but I was certain of one thing. You wouldn't come here to apologize. Ethan stood suddenly. You're going to destroy this family over money? No, Marion said, rising too. You did that when you decided I wasn't family unless I was paying for something. There was silence, heavy, unforgiving. You taught me something, Ethan, she added. That sometimes silence is the loudest betrayal. But you know what else? I'm done being silent. She turned to Isabel. You slapped me in public on a day I helped pay for, and you laughed with him like it was a joke. And now you want peace? Isabel's lip trembled, her perfect image cracking for the first time. Marion smiled, not cruelly, but fully, not from triumph, from freedom. This isn't revenge, she said. This is repair. I'm fixing the broken things, starting with me. Ethan stepped back, like he no longer recognized the woman standing in front of him. Maybe he didn't. Marion picked up her tea again, calm returning to her voice. You have 20 days left, she said. You know how this works. Margaret's letter outlined everything. And then, as Ethan reached for some final plea, she added, Oh, and one more thing. Any further conversation must go through my attorney. That's what she's paid for. For the first time in years, Marion watched them leave, not from a window, not with longing, but from her doorway, as a woman who had nothing left to beg for. Within days of the confrontation at her house, Marion's phone started ringing again, but she never answered. Margaret had been clear, let them go through me. That's why I'm here. So Marion let the silence do its work. Let Ethan stew in the weight of being ignored by the woman he had taken for granted his entire life. Instead, she watered her plants, took longer walks in the morning, signed up for a poetry workshop at the senior center. The ache in her chest was still there, but it wasn't sorrow anymore. It was fire. The letters came first. Ethan, through his new attorney, David Brennigan, someone from a firm Marion recognized from TV commercials, sent a flurry of papers filled with legal jargon and escalating tones. First letter, there must be some misunderstanding. Second, my client strongly refutes these claims and considers them defamatory. Third, we are prepared to pursue a counterclaim for emotional distress. Margaret read each one with the detachment of a surgeon reviewing an X-ray. This, she said, tapping the second letter, is pure theater. By week 4, Ethan had taken it up a notch. Marion received emails from distant cousins she hadn't spoken to in years, each with a variation of the same plea. He's your son. Don't destroy your own family over money. But the family had already been destroyed, not by a lawsuit, but by years of unspoken betrayal. And Marion? She responded to none of it. Margaret handled everything with calm precision. Let them spin their web, she said. You just keep showing up for yourself. And Marian did. She showed up in yoga class. She showed up at the farmer's market. She even showed up for herself in the mirror, wearing lipstick again for the first time in 15 years. Then came the mediation date. It was held in a neutral office downtown, a sleek, sterile conference space with glass walls and filtered water dispensers. Marian wore her best navy blue sweater and a scarf Eleanor had sent her from Ireland. Ethan walked in first, flanked by his attorney. He looked tense, older, the corners of his mouth tight with resentment. He didn't meet her eyes. Margaret greeted the other lawyer politely, then opened her binder with practiced ease. The mediator, a woman in her 50s with salt and pepper curls and a firm tone, opened the session. Let's begin with initial offers. David Brennigan cleared his throat and leaned forward. My client is willing to offer $30,000 to resolve this matter and put it behind the family. No admission of wrongdoing, of course. Marian didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Margaret smiled. Counteroffer, $97,412. Full repayment of documented loans, plus reasonable interest and legal fees. The room went still. Ethan looked like someone had slapped him. You're not serious, he said, his voice flat. Marian finally looked at him. Her gaze was level, calm. You thought I wouldn't keep track, she said quietly. But I did. Every dollar, every lie. You're my mother, Ethan said, exasperated. Why would you do this? I'm your mother, Marian replied. And that used to mean something to me. But now, it means being financially abused and humiliated in front of 200 people. So no, Ethan, $30,000 won't cut it. The mediator stepped in, trying to guide the conversation back into legal territory. But Ethan kept glancing at Marian like she'd morphed into a stranger. She had. Or rather, she'd finally become the woman he never expected her to be. Someone who would no longer apologize for asking to be treated with respect. For the rest of the session, she said little. Margaret did the heavy lifting, walking through each document, each transfer, each loan. She had charts, summaries, clear math. There was no escaping the reality. Ethan owed the money, every bit of it. And more than that, he had no leverage left. By the end of the day, his attorney's voice had lost its earlier bravado. We'll need to discuss further, he muttered, gathering the folders like a gambler gathering his final chips. Marian stood, calmly smoothing her scarf. Take your time, she said. I'm not going anywhere. As they left the room, Ethan lagged behind, then turned back. You're not the mother I remember, he said bitterly. Marian paused in the doorway, then turned. No, she said. I'm the mother you forgot you had. It was early morning when the knock came again. Marian had just returned from her walk, her breath still steady from the cool Tennessee air, her cheeks glowing. She wore her favorite cardigan, the soft cream one with the missing button, and was carrying a small bag of oranges from the corner market. She opened the door slowly, expecting a delivery. But it was Isabel. And this time, there were no sunglasses, no designer blouse, no carefully poised performance. Just red-rimmed eyes, a blotchy face, and hands wringing a tissue like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know I shouldn't be here, but I didn't know where else to go. Marian didn't invite her in. She didn't offer tea. She simply raised an eyebrow and said, You have 5 minutes. Isabel stepped onto the porch, gripping the railing like she needed it for balance. I didn't know, she started. I swear I didn't know about all the money, the loans, the investments. He never told me the full story. He always said, you offered. Marian gave a short, dry laugh. Offered, that's convenient. Tears welled in Isabel's eyes again. He's been seeing someone for almost a year, one of his co-workers. I found texts, hotel receipts. I confronted him, and he didn't even deny it. Said I was too demanding, that I made him feel small. Marian said nothing, just watched the woman unravel. We're separating, Isabel continued. I already contacted a divorce attorney, but that's not why I'm here. No, Marian asked. I just wanted you to know Isabel paused, took a shaky breath. I think I hated you because I envied you. You loved Ethan so much, so deeply, and he threw it away like it was nothing. I see that now. Marion crossed her arms. You slapped me in front of 200 people. I know. Isabel's voice cracked, and I will never forgive myself for it. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Marion said softly but firmly, That's your burden to carry, not mine. She turned to go back inside. Please, Isabel whispered, desperate. Will you at least believe me when I say I'm sorry? Marion paused in the doorway. I believe you're sorry for what your life has become. But what you did to me, that was a choice, a very public one. She stepped inside and gently closed the door, leaving Isabel on the porch alone. 2 days later, the settlement came. Marion sat beside Margaret in the same sterile office as before. Ethan looked defeated now. His suit was wrinkled. He hadn't shaved. The fire in his eyes had been replaced with quiet resignation. We'll pay $50,000 today, David Brannigan announced, and the remainder, $47,400 in fees, will be repaid over 24 months. The house deed will be held as collateral. Marion said nothing. She simply nodded, calm and unmoved, as the papers were passed for signatures. Ethan didn't meet her gaze once. When it was over, she stood and gathered her things. As they left the room, Margaret leaned in and whispered, He never saw you coming. Marion allowed herself the smallest of smiles. 3 weeks later, the check cleared, and Marion did something she hadn't done in 40 years. She packed a suitcase. Not for a wedding, not for a family emergency, not for Ethan, for herself. She booked a flight to Paris, non-refundable, business class, and used part of the settlement to reserve a month-long stay in a small apartment near the Seine. She bought walking shoes, a good camera, and a guidebook marked with tiny flags at every place she'd dreamed of since she was a teenager. The day she left, the neighbor Helen helped her to the taxi. Where to this time, Marion? Helen asked. Europe, she said. Starting with Paris, then who knows? Helen grinned. You're glowing, you know that? Marion touched her scarf, a soft lilac one Eleanor had sent from Ireland. I feel it, she said. For the first time in years, I feel like I belong to myself. As the taxi pulled away, Marion didn't look back. She had nothing to return to, only everything ahead. The calendar told her it had been exactly 1 year, 12 months since the final check cleared, 365 days since she last heard Ethan's voice. Not that she'd expected to. Not a call, not a message, not a single attempt at reconciliation. He had vanished the moment the last dollar left his account, as though their bond had always been transactional. And perhaps it had. Marion stood in her living room, now subtly transformed. Where once there had been shelves filled with framed photos of Ethan from his kindergarten graduation, his Little League games, prom night, there were now canvases, images from Spain, Italy, Ireland. Her favorite was a photo of herself standing on the edge of a cliff in Cinque Terre, the wind catching her scarf, the sea behind her stretching out endlessly like a second chance. She smiled at it now. On the mantel, there was only one photo of Ethan left, a baby picture, tucked inside a drawer. She couldn't quite bring herself to throw it out, but it no longer defined the space, no longer defined her. After returning from Europe, Marion had begun to rebuild her life, not in dramatic, flashy ways, but through small acts of choosing herself. She joined a local cooking class, partly for the joy of learning, mostly for the company. That's where she met Eleanor, 69 Irish, recently widowed, with a sharp tongue and a laugh that echoed like music. They'd bonded over burnt risotto and a shared love of lavender tea. Soon, Eleanor had become more than a cooking partner. She became the friend Marion hadn't realized she was missing. You know what your problem is? Eleanor had teased once, elbow deep in pastry dough. You were too bloody good at loving people who didn't deserve it. Marion had laughed so hard she nearly dropped the mixing bowl. Now, A year later, Eleanor was visiting. She sat in Marion's kitchen in her signature green shawl, sipping tea like she'd always belonged there. "So," Eleanor said, glancing at the wall of travel photos, "any regrets?" Marion paused, stirring honey into her cup. "Just one." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "That I waited so long," Marion replied. They fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the soft hum of Marion's new kettle and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. Outside, late spring painted Tennessee in hues of gold and green. The lilac bushes Marion had planted last year were in full bloom. "You know," Eleanor said after a moment, "I used to think silence was a kind of punishment. After my husband died, I hated how quiet the house became. But now, I think silence can be a victory too." Marion nodded. "It is." She thought of all the noise Ethan had created in her life, his demands, his guilt trips, the way his approval felt like a prize she had to earn. And now, with that silence stretched across a full year, she understood what Eleanor meant. Peace wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came in the quiet reclaiming of your own space. Marion walked over to the kitchen table and picked up a small journal. The pages were filled now, not with heartbreak, but with recipes, ideas, dreams. She opened to the latest entry and read aloud. "I used to think motherhood meant never putting yourself first. That love meant sacrifice without expectation. But maybe love, true love, means teaching people how to treat you by how you treat yourself. And maybe the greatest legacy isn't what we give others, but what we give ourselves permission to become." Eleanor smiled. "You're turning into a bloody poet." Marion laughed. "Don't tempt me. I might write a memoir next." "Do it," Eleanor said. "Call it The Woman Who Walked Away with Everything That Mattered." They clinked teacups like champagne glasses. Later that afternoon, Marion found herself standing in her bedroom staring at the small box tucked beneath her dresser. Inside were old letters, Ethan's childhood drawings, and the final receipt from the settlement. She considered throwing it out, but she didn't. Not because she was holding on, but because it reminded her how far she'd come. When Eleanor left the next morning, Marion drove her to the airport. As they hugged goodbye, Eleanor whispered, "You're not alone, Marion. You never were. You just needed to stop chasing ghosts." Marion nodded, watching her friend disappear into the terminal. Driving home, she didn't take the freeway. She took the long way, windows down, music low, the scent of wildflowers drifting in. At a red light, her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She stared at it for a moment, then pressed ignore. She had tea to make. The sky was beginning to blush pink when Marion arrived home from the market, arms full of peonies and fresh bread. The wind carried the smell of early summer, salted air from the lake, honeysuckle in bloom, and she stood still for a moment, soaking it in. It had been 2 weeks since Eleanor flew back to Ireland. 2 weeks of gentle routines and long evening walks, of humming while cooking and falling asleep with a book still open on her chest. Her house was hers again, not a museum of lost relationships, but a canvas for new peace. She was preparing tea when she noticed the envelope on her front porch. No postage. Hand-delivered. Her name, Marion, was written in familiar handwriting, the kind she used to see on birthday cards tucked into Ethan's school projects. For a second, just one fleeting heartbeat. Something tightened in her chest. She set the kettle down and took the envelope into the living room, sat in her favorite chair, opened it. Inside was a birthday card. On the front, pastel flowers and the printed message, "Wishing you peace on your special day." Inside, nothing but a signature. Ethan. No apology, no acknowledgement, no attempt at healing. Just a gesture. Empty. Calculated. Too little. Far too late. For a moment, Marion stared at the card, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. There was no ache, no rising wave of grief or longing, just a cool stillness, the kind that follows after you've cried every tear, asked every question, and finally stopped waiting for an answer. She walked slowly to the fireplace, knelt before it, and struck a match. The paper curled, darkened, then flared. She watched the card blacken and curl at the edges, the handwriting disappearing into ash. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just smiled. It was not a smile of revenge. It wasn't even triumph. It was clarity. She poured herself a cup of tea and walked to the back porch, where the wind moved gently through the trees, and the birds were starting their late afternoon chorus. The pain was gone now, replaced by something stronger: sovereignty. Not over others, but over herself. Marian knew now that love didn't mean being a doormat, that forgiveness without accountability wasn't grace, it was surrender, that motherhood didn't require martyrdom, and that the greatest gift you could give a child wasn't money or endless sacrifice. It was the example of a life lived fully, even after heartbreak. That evening, she drove to the coast. It wasn't far. Just an hour from her home, a quiet little spot she'd once taken Ethan to when he was 5 and obsessed with seashells. Back then, he'd run barefoot down the shore, collecting broken pieces of coral and shouting each time he found one, shaped like a heart. Now, she stood there alone, her silver hair dancing in the breeze, the hem of her linen dress fluttering around her calves. She sat on a weathered bench overlooking the waves, breathed, and for the first time, truly felt the weight of her own peace. It wasn't silence because she had nothing left to say. It was silence because she no longer needed to speak to prove anything, to him, to the world, even to herself. Her value was not up for debate. It never had been. Somewhere behind her, a couple laughed. A child squealed. Life went on, and Marian? She closed her eyes. Let the wind carry every last ghost away. And now, dear listener, if you've followed her story this far, she has a question for you. What would you do if your own child betrayed your trust and erased your sacrifices like they were nothing? Would you forgive them? Would you fight? Would you walk away? Comment below with your thoughts, because sometimes sharing your truth is the first step toward healing your own story. And as you sit with that question, Marian will leave you with this final image: a woman, older, wiser, alone, but not lonely, sitting at the edge of the world, not as someone cast out, but as someone who finally chose herself. Wind in her silver hair, tea in hand, a smile on her lips. Peace, not given, earned.